to hand over to Emily Reid from the Devon Climate Emergency. And I'm going to leave it to you, Emily, to explain your role and yeah. Okay, so great to have you here, Emily, and over to you.
Great, thank you. Is it possible to make me a co-host so I can share my screen, please?
Yes. Are you not already? Okay. There you go.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Right, 1 moment. Always takes me a second to... How's that?
That's great.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, really nice to come and speak to you this evening. And sorry I couldn't make it along to your event on Saturday, but it sounds like it was a productive session. So I'm sure, well, I hope that some of you know a little bit about the Devon Climate Emergency Partnership, but I'm not going to assume that too much. So it might be a refresher for some of you and an introduction for others. So I'll just get you up to speed as to what we've done to date and where we are in the process, and then tell you a little bit about some of our latest activity, which is the Citizens Assembly, some of the work we're doing on adaptation, and how we're documenting the change that is happening, including some of the activity by CAG Devon. And then I just want to highlight some of the resources that we've got that might be of use to you and how you can keep in touch with what we do. So the Devon Climate Emergency Partnership was set up in 2019 to respond to the increasing concern about how little time we have left to really get started on our journey towards net zero. So overall, it's aiming to create a resilient net zero carbon Devon where people and nature thrive. And there's a partnership of 29 organisations, as you can see on the right there, including all of the local authorities in Devon, not just the Devon County Council area, but also Plymouth and Torbay. And third sector organisations such as the Devon Wildlife Trust, as well as private companies such as South West Water and Western Power Distribution. And together, we're working to reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2050 at the latest, and improve resilience of Devon's environment, because we know that we're already locked into a certain amount of climate change, and we've got to prepare our environment and communities for a warmer world. So just in terms of how the partnership actually works, there's a response group, which is sort of CEO, director level representation from the partners, and they set the strategy, and they're supported by a tactical group, which is the majority of which is representation from the local authorities, primarily by their climate change officers. There are other organisations who put staff onto that group to share knowledge and support the workings of the partnership. And then we've got two streams. We've got the emissions reduction, so mitigation, and the adaptation. The mitigation is led by a volunteer task force, the Net Zero Task Force, which is chaired by Patrick Devine-Wright from the University of Exeter. And he's one of the authors on the International Panel on Climate Change reports on climate, the latest on climate science. And then we've got the Climate Impacts Group, which is chaired by the Environment Agency, heading up the work looking at climate impacts and working towards an adaptation plan. So we're already working with the University of Exeter to track Devon's baseline greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see here, the built environment, both residential and also commercial properties, is the largest share of our emissions, but transport is also a really significant share with 30%. And then waste, agriculture, and also industries, also significant sources of emissions. But we are making progress in Devon, although we can't take claim that this progress is due to the partnership, because obviously we only started in 2019. So we're hoping for that number to start coming down more rapidly now. So in terms of how we've developed the interim Devon Carbon Plan, working towards the final carbon plan, there was a significant evidence gathering phase. Some of you may have sent in ideas of how we can achieve net zero through the public call of evidence. There was a youth parliament event and thematic hearings. I'll tell you a bit more about those. And they were synthesised into a draft interim Devon Carbon Plan that set out the ideas that seemed to have greater public acceptability and were less contentious, that we could set out and articulate. And that went out for public consultation, and we're now making amendments on the back of that public consultation. The evidence gathering phase also helped us to identify which were the issues that needed more deliberation, more input from Devon citizens, and those went to a citizens' assembly that we had to hold online because of the pandemic. And we've got a report from that and are working towards a public consultation on actions that reflect the outcomes of the assembly. And collectively, the actions from the reflecting the Devon Climate Assembly and the actions in the existing interim Devon Carbon Plan will come together to be a final Devon Carbon Plan. So the evidence gathering phase, we had 859 submissions from the public as to what we could do to overcome the barriers to achieve net zero. We had thematic hearings, so roundtable meetings on food, land and sea, the built environment, mobility, energy and waste, and a summary hearing picking up those cross-cutting themes of spatial planning, behaviour change, procurement and industrial strategy. This is what the thematic hearings actually look like in practice. So we held them at different places across the county. Here we've got Plymouth University and the Marine Laboratory. The Youth Parliament had 75 students from 15 schools attend, and they came out with some really good, meaningful suggestions as well. And the public consultation had 1,321 responses, and people were overwhelmingly supportive of the content of the plan, but they did tell us that it could be more concise. So we're working to make it a slightly sort of punchier, more digestible document. So here's the Youth Parliament in action, and they had a symbolic tree planting at the end of it. So the interim Devon Carbon Plan, it shows a pathway of how we can achieve net zero by 2050 at the latest. And it says, what do we need to do to overcome the big challenges to reach net zero? And we've picked out some of the opportunities and co-benefits of doing that for things like health and the economy. And it's not a plan just for local authorities. It is for everyone, from citizens to businesses and local authorities. We're really clear in the plan that we do need more resources and we do need new policy. It can't be delivered within our existing situation. So, but we are also really clear that actually there are significant opportunities for us to redirect existing spending as well. So it's not all new money that we need. The plan's broken down into cross-cutting themes, economy and resources, energy supply, the built environment, transport and food, land and sea. So as I said, those more contentious issues that needed further, more in-depth deliberation went to the Citizens' Assembly. We invited a 70-strong panel of Devon's residents. They were demographically representative of Devon, so we sent out 14,000 invites. And we asked people a few questions about, their age, which part of Devon they lived in, and so on, so that we could have 70 people in the room that really represented Devon's diversity. And the University of Exeter advised us on the process, and we worked with Involve, who specialise in supporting these democratic processes. So we met online for 25 hours during June and July of this summer, and members, they received presentations, they had a learning phase, they discussed what they had heard and deliberated about the context of the climate emergency more broadly, and the specific topics they were being asked to address for Devon. So the challenges we asked them to focus on were: how should we encourage people to reduce car use? How should we encourage people to retrofit buildings? And what should the role of onshore wind energy be in Devon? So the Assembly proposed a series of resolutions for each challenge and a set of conditions that would make those resolutions more acceptable for Devon. And that was published in a report on the 12th of October. They told us some overarching messages: that the partnership overall needs to communicate and inform, involve communities, act with urgency, show ambition, demonstrate leadership, show accountability, and work with central government on the issues that require further funding and policy, for instance. So energy, and this is a paraphrasing of their words. So if you want to hear these issues in their own words, there's 14 recommendations that you can dig into with many more conditions, but they strongly support onshore wind on the whole, but particularly when controlled by local communities. For transport, they strongly supported the electrification of vehicles. There was some support for congestion charging and low emission zones, but little support for increasing car parking charges or workplace parking levies. And most of all, they wanted to see sustainable alternatives for transport in place before these things took place. For buildings, there was support for using regulation to require people to upgrade their homes. So specifically, strong support for doing so through the planning system. So for instance, if you went to get planning for an extension to your house, being required to make some energy efficiency improvements to your overall house. And also the idea of linking council tax and business rates to the building's energy performance. So we are now in the latter stages of this process. We're developing recommendations, actions to add to the Devon Carbon Plan that reflect the Climate Assembly, and these are going out for public consultation in March. And we're still making amendments to the previously consulted on interim Devon Carbon Plan to incorporate the recommendations from the consultation on that document. And they'll come together, as I said, in August 2022 to be incorporated into policy by the partner organisations. So we are also developing an adaptation plan, as I said, and it's actually a Devon, Cornwall and Isles of Scilly adaptation plan. We're working regionally on this because that reflects some of the existing regional collaborations that respond to civil emergencies already, such as the Local Resilience Forum. And the group has so far produced a report summarising the latest climate projections for South West England, and has produced some narratives reviewing the health effects, the flood and coastal risk, and potential environmental impacts, amongst other things. And we've put in a funding bid to get some 6-month resource to accelerate the delivery of this work, because it has fallen a little bit behind the work on developing a Devon Carbon Plan for emissions reduction. So we hope to have a website page up on with the Climate Impacts Group documents soon, so that you can look at that in more detail. But change is already happening. We're not waiting to finalise all of the plans before the partners do anything about climate change. There's lots of things already happening. So, for instance, there's 220 electric vehicle charging sockets are expected to be installed across Devon by December 2022. Work started on Marsh Barton Railway Station in Exeter. Planning applications have been submitted for the Teen Estuary Trail to improve cycling and active travel routes. The Devon Food Partnership's been set up to promote healthy food for all and sustainable food for the planet. There's a 6 million sustainable warmth grant, improving the energy efficiency of inefficient homes for the most vulnerable people in the county. And well, I could go on, but there's more detail on our website if you want to dig into the stories of what's already happening. And one of the stories on our website that we're really happy to share is about CAG Devon. So we were pleased to tell people earlier on this year that community groups in Devon have quadrupled the amount of waste prevented from entering landfill sites. And this also went out on our social media channels as well. And so I just wanted to sort of convey to you the fact that actually community action groups are written into the Devon Carbon Plan already. They're explicitly mentioned under Goal 7.4 to avoid creating waste through consuming less, sharing and repairing. And the plan explicitly recognises that you're already doing a fantastic job of bringing citizens together so that they can learn from each other and share experiences and skills. The CAG Devon network supports communities to develop projects and organise events to reduce waste and promote sustainable living. When change comes from the community, there is often better buy-in through positive effects of peer-to-peer social network. So, you know, we really explicitly recognise that this is something that needs to be happening. And the actions that we feel that this is contributing to in the Devon Carbon Plan are to deliver ongoing targeted communication and engagement, to empower all social groups in Devon to act on the impacts of how things are made and distributed, and promote more sustainable consumption habits, the prevention of waste, particularly food, and the shift to a culture of reduction, reuse and recycling. And also we recognise that there's an action on us to support communities to establish and promote repair cafes, share sheds and community composting schemes, for example, by providing funding or premises. So this is, you know, we recognise that you're already doing a lot towards the things that we want to see more of. On our website, we are collating resources that we think are helpful, and there is a page particularly for community groups where you can calculate your carbon footprint for an area, and there's a link to recent funding updates, as well as more detail signposting to information about energy, waste, mobility, such as car sharing schemes, resources that advise on how to set up a farmer's market, for instance, or how to set up a community garden. So we'd love for you to have a look and you know, tell us, is it useful? Would you like to see some other resources on there? Is there anything else that you know of that we should add to it? So as well as keeping an eye on our website, do also follow us on social media and sign up for our newsletter. You can sign up for the newsletter through the website. It's /join after our address. And as I said, we will be consulting, having public consultation again in March, and we would love for you to respond to that when the time comes and have your input into the plan. Great, I will stop sharing.
Fantastic. Emily, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. Some of that I was aware of, some of it I wasn't, so it was really helpful, and particularly interested to hear the adaptation plan on a regional basis and to see how that pans out. I've got a quick question. I'm going to butt in. I know we're supposed to be doing questions after Peter's talk, but I've got a quick question. In terms of the Climate Assembly, were you, in terms of the numbers of invitations you sent out, was it easy to get your kind of 70 people together? Or, was it a hard push, or were you overwhelmed with, yes, please, I want to be involved?
So we worked with, as well as the Involve Foundation, we worked with the Sortition Foundation, and they specialise in civic lotteries and giving everyone an equal opportunity to participate in these sorts of events. So they were able to help us sort of get a feel as to how the response rate to the invites that we sent out compared to other events, other citizens' assemblies that they'd worked on. And they expected something like a 3% response rate. Apparently that's normal. And I think we got sort of a few point something of a percentage sort of lower than might be expected. And the only reason that we could think of that might be the case was because we were coming out of lockdown and people were umming and ahhing about their summer holidays and where they might go. But actually we still got several hundred responses, and we were able to still select 70 people that fulfilled all of the demographic targets that we were after.
Great, thank you. Thank you. I was just butting in at that point. Okay, I'm going to suggest, I'm sure there are lots of other questions that have been stimulated by that talk. So do you want to pop those in the chat, unless you're very good at remembering them, and save them for the Q&A. But if you want to start putting things in the questions in the chat, that would be great. Again, we're going to be coming back to Emily in a little while at the Q&A. But I'd like to just kind of keep things moving, and I'm going to hand over without further ado to Peter. And maybe Peter, you can. I mean, I've said that you're involved at the university, but it might be interesting to share what your role is, because I liked the way you phrased it when we first met, that it was kind of translating university jargon to plain speak, to get more people involved and engaged in what you're up to. But also, yeah, that great heritage of being at Eden Project and CAG Oxfordshire as well. Anyway, I'm just going to hand over to Peter.
Great. Thanks, Helen. Hi, everyone. I'm glad you reminded me how I described my job, because I think I describe it differently every time. So I'm glad I have to try and remember that. Lovely to see you all here. I'm just going to share my screen. And yeah, so this is what I'm going to talk about. This idea of positive tipping points. And this gives me a good excuse to talk about my role at the university, which is I'm setting up something called the Green Futures Network, which is a new network to increase access, basically, to the environmental and climate work that the university is doing. At the University of Exeter, we like to talk about how leading and innovative we are in the climate world, which is all very good. And we've got the 5 most influential climate scientists in the UK, which is one of those statistics that doesn't really mean anything when you think about it, but sounds very good. But it's all kind of about, well, what does that mean? What does that actually mean to people who are, on the ground in communities, in businesses, making policy? And so part of my role is to help take that research, those resources, those opportunities for collaboration from the university and make them more accessible externally. And that's one of the things I'm going to be talking about today. A specific bit of research that I think is really interesting and deserves to be explored in terms of how that can have an impact on community climate action. As Helen mentioned, so I used to work for CAG Oxfordshire. In fact, I still have the napkin that I sketched the first iteration of that logo on the screen in my possession. And so a kind of community response to climate action is very much kind of in my heritage. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some research that we've been doing, why I think it's useful at a community level. And then after the Q&A, as Helen said, I've got a couple of exercises that I think are useful ones for community groups to go through to think about their impact in a slightly different way in what is a changing world, post-COP and beyond. So I want to talk very briefly about this idea of systems thinking, which is what I'm going to touch on, but not in a huge amount of detail, because it's something that I could talk about for days on end. But I think this picture summarizes the kind of the gist of what I am going to be talking about, which is how to think about impact and what's going on beneath the kind of the immediate of what's happening. And I think this graphic displays it quite well, this idea of an iceberg, which you can think about as being bigger below the surface than it is above it. And so we see certain things going on, but actually there's a lot of things happening beneath that. The patterns that dictate what happened, the structures that enforce those patterns, and the mental models, which might be our beliefs or our values, that influence these structures. So don't worry, I'm not going to go into too much heavy theory, but this I think is a helpful way of visualizing what I'm talking about. Another way to visualize it is this one, which is one of my favorite graphics when I'm talking about some of the work that I do, because I think it's a really helpful way to communicate how, as human beings, we're very good at being very bad at understanding how the world works around us. And when we get together and we get in our little rooms, it's very alluring to start thinking about things in quite a linear way. We start at A, we do something, and we get to B. And that's often how we talk about things in our communications, in our funding applications. But as we all know, and as this character who's opening the door and saying Toto, which is a Finnish word. This is a Finnish cartoon. It's a Finnish equivalent of or what they're saying is acknowledging that actually once you open the door to the real world, you start to remember how messy and complex and uncertain it is in ways that don't really relate to how we talk about it or how we try and hold it in our minds sometimes. And this can be quite problematic a lot of the time. And one helpful way of thinking about this problem, and kind of one more frame I want to offer before getting into this concept of tipping points, is thinking about systems in terms of complicated and complex. And this is the differentiation I find quite useful to think about it. So you could think about a complicated system as being represented on the left-hand side by a bicycle. So a bicycle is understandable. It has a correct answer. It is predictable. You know, if you pull this lever or you turn that pedal, you know what is going to happen. You could take it apart and you can put it back together again. There is a correct answer for how that bicycle functions. And to be able to control that system, you need expertise. So if, for example, you're a community group and your project is restoring bicycles, it's quite easy to understand how to control that. You know how you can have the impact you want to have. Maybe you want to fix 100 bicycles a week. Great. As long as you can get 100 bicycles in, then you could probably achieve that target. On the other hand, we have a complex system, which is here represented by not just a bike, but a cyclist. And as soon as you add in this human element to the system, it becomes quite different. So it's not fully understandable. There's not a correct answer to how that system is going to function. So it might be partially predictable. You might be able to know, you might know where they're going. You might know their energy levels. You might know the traffic on their journey, but you probably aren't going to know all of those things. And there's still lots of other things you're not going to have the answer for. So to understand that system, we need more than expertise. We need perspective, and we need multiple perspectives. And the crucial thing here is we cannot fully understand and control that system. And that's okay, but it's important to recognize that. So again, thinking about if you're a community group and your project is not just restoring bicycles, but it's advocating for cycling and getting more people out cycling on the streets. So maybe you do cycle proficiency training or something like that. So I'm thinking of a CAG in Oxfordshire that I used to work with called Broken Spoke, who do that very thing. So their model of repairing bicycles was a very controllable part of their project, but their model of increasing cycling is a much different, more complex challenge. And if they treated them both in the same way, that will create a lot of problems. And so I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And to do that, I want to share a story that is a relatively famous story in the world of systems thinking. And I think it's quite a neat one to articulate some of these challenges. And this story is from the middle of last century in Borneo. And the story starts with an outbreak of mosquitoes, which led to an outbreak of malaria. So the problem was, okay, we've got too many mosquitoes, they're infecting people, and we've got an outbreak of malaria. Okay, so there's the problem. So the solution that was arrived at was, okay, let's spray everything with DDT, which is an insecticide, to kill the mosquitoes, and that in return will reduce the amount of malaria. And that happened. That was the outcome. So that was good. But unfortunately, because we're talking not here about a simple, linear, complicated system with a right answer, we're talking about the real world, which is much more complex. There were some other impacts of this action. So the DDT, it turns out, also killed some of the local wasps and a lot of the insect population. And the wasps, their favorite food was the thatch-eating caterpillars. And now the caterpillars ate the thatch of the local houses. But when they were kept in check by the wasps, that wasn't a problem. But as soon as the DDT started killing the wasps, that meant there were more caterpillars, and that meant a lot of the thatched roofs fell in. So a lot of the people were left without homes. Now the wasps were also eaten by the geckos, and the geckos were eaten by the cats. Now the geckos were fine, they weren't impacted by the insecticide in the wasps, but the cats, however, were. And so a lot of the local cats died. And the cats were particularly good at eating the rats. And without cats, we had more rats. And that led up to an outbreak of 2 new diseases. So this is a very messy and complex slide, but I hope this communicates just the nature of how things happen in the real world. They're not neat and easy A to B. There's a lot of unintended consequences. And here is a particularly dramatic example, I think, of trying to eradicate one disease led to the outbreak of 2 more. Now, the kind of the moral of the story is threefold, and I think a helpful starting point to that is that the solution they ended up coming to that challenge was literally parachuting in cats to Borneo to eat the rats that had proliferated when the original cats had died. So I think if you get to a point in any project you're doing where you're having to parachute in cats to fix the problem, you know you've probably done something wrong somewhere along the line. So hopefully that's not where we get to. But the three points I'm trying to make with this that I think are really important when thinking about any type of climate action, but really community climate action is very relevant, is firstly, we cannot control everything, and that's okay. It can be hard to let go of that idea, but it's really, really important. And secondly, it's natural for things to be uncertain. That's normal. As human beings, we're not very good at holding uncertainty, but it is natural. It's part of everything that we're doing. And thirdly, things don't happen in straight lines. It's very easy to think that things are going to occur in a kind of a gradual way. But actually, as we know, I mean, whether it's climate change or other things can happen very quickly, things can happen very slowly, and those things don't always happen in the ways that you expect them to. And so this is really encapsulated by some of the work that we're doing at the university, and I think it's really relevant to community action, because very often, and this is not just communities, with businesses, with the university, with lots of organizations, we're really suckered into this idea of, to fix the challenges that we're facing, the interconnected crises, we have to find new solutions. And the word innovation comes up a lot. We love using the word innovation at the University of Exeter. It's literally in my department title, the word innovation. It's used all the time, and sometimes that's really good. But innovation is all about creating new solutions, which is not always the right thing to do, because sometimes we might create new solutions to problems that create other problems further down the line because we don't really understand what we're trying to do. And actually, a more important and more effective way of achieving change could be not looking at new solutions, but it can be this idea. What we want to do is create the right conditions for positive change to happen. So this is talking about letting go of control, acknowledging that we can't necessarily come up with a solution because we probably don't understand every single part of the problem. But what we can do is we can start creating the conditions where positive change can emerge, because also we're not the only people trying to do the right thing. We're not the only people trying to create positive change. And so if we can kind of help do what we can and influence what we can be part of that solution, not trying to take responsibility for everything, and being able to understand that uncertainty is a key part of this. Now, this happens all the time. It's quite an abstract concept, but this is happening all the time. And a really good example is the movement for mutual aid, which occurred during the first lockdown. And we saw a huge proliferation of mutual aid support groups popping up all over the country. And there was some central organization of those, but very loose and very informal. What we really saw was this network of community response that was really interesting and very fluid and very organic. But it didn't come from nowhere. It came because the conditions were there. There were existing community groups. There were people who understood what the need was in that community. There were resources that they had to hand. And those conditions meant that this solution could emerge. It wasn't one person's idea. It wasn't a new solution. It was just something that emerged from those conditions being right at the right time. So this stuff happens, but it's a lot harder to notice because it's not as shiny as a new idea that can be packaged up and branded in a different way. Now at the university, one of the bits of research I think is really relevant to this and really interesting is some work around tipping points that Professor Tim Lenton of the GSI, which stands for the Global Systems Institute, is doing. And this is something that he was talking about at COP last week. And when we think of tipping points, we often think of negative tipping points. That's what we hear a lot about. We hear about kind of carbon tipping points. We hear about greenhouse gas tipping points. We hear about ice melting, all sorts of negative tipping points. But actually, the research that Tim is doing is into this idea of positive tipping points, which is starting to think about, yes, there are tipping points that are negative and will create change that happens in a non-linear way, in a way that gets really, really quick all of a sudden. But also there are tipping points in our ecosystem in lots of different ways that are going to have positive impacts. And we're just starting to understand what those are. So 3 examples. One is clean energy generations. This is a relatively easy example to get your head around. Is thinking about so renewable energy has been around for many years, but it's been very slow. There hasn't been the subsidies that fossil fuel industry gets, and it's been quite a gradual uptake. However, that's starting to change, and as more and more people take advantage of renewable energies, the technology improves, the cost comes down, and this really starts to be an upward curve. And we're getting very, very close within clean energy generation of a tipping point. It's already wind and solar are the cheapest forms of energy. Obviously, that's not enough in and of itself to tip the entire system because a lot of countries are locked in at the moment to coal and oil and gas. But we are approaching those tipping points, which will mean that change happens much, much more quickly than it has been more recently. Another one is thinking about ecosystems. So again, often we think about tipping points in an ecosystem as a negative thing. We hear about the destruction of rainforests and biodiversity, and that is absolutely happening in a lot of places and really needs to be addressed. But we're also seeing positive tipping points in the regeneration of a lot of ecosystems. And again, it's not about bringing in one solution to fix nature. It's about understanding the conditions that these ecosystems need to flourish and to heal themselves and to do what nature just does. You know, it's a very resilient system, and the more we understand that, the more we can create those right conditions to regenerate, whether it's forests, whether it's rainforests, or whether it's simply a kind of a grass meadow in a local park. And third example, and there's many more than these, is thinking about electric vehicles. So similarly to clean energy generation, electric vehicles have been around for a fair amount of time, but again, we're getting to those tipping points. We heard from Emily about the Charging points, there's going to be 230 new charging points in Devon by the end of next year. And thinking about this is happening all over the country, all over the world. Again, it's getting cheaper. There are still a lot of barriers in the way and a lot of parts of that system that haven't yet been figured out. But as we get closer and closer to that tipping point, we get to a point where things just take over. And I'm not just talking about the market and people buying more electric vehicles, but the infrastructure available to them, the public perception of them. There's a lot in here about data, but also about social sciences and behaviour change. So I think this is some really interesting research that's being done, and I can share some links to it afterwards if you want to look into more detail. But I want to talk now a little bit more about how this can be applied to communities taking climate action. And to do that, I want to talk about a couple of examples. So this is something Tim talks about when he's sharing his research, is a story from Easter Parade, which is in Fifth Avenue in New York City. So my first picture is from the year 1900. And what you can see here is hundreds of horse-drawn carts and one circled in red automobile. So this is in 1900, and then the same street, the same parade, the same city, but 13 years later, what we can now see is hundreds of automobiles and one horse-drawn cart. And now we probably think this might not necessarily be a positive tipping point now that we know the impact that that cars have on the climate crisis. But what this does demonstrate is how these tipping points can work, and how in 13 years our entire understanding of what is normal is shifted, beyond compare. It's a completely different picture. And 13 years is nothing really, and especially that would be a lot quicker now as well, of how quickly technology happens. So this is, over 100 years ago, a really quick change in a very short space of time. And this is how change happens. And again, as human beings, we're not generally very good at noticing it. So it has to be kind of pointed out to us for us to see how things can change quite rapidly. And I think the only and last graph I want to show you is this one, which tells a similar story. So this is a graph telling us about the share of US households using specific technologies. So it's US specific, but it's be very equivalent to this country. And you can see the steeper the line is, the quicker this new technology was taken up. And this tells a story of this is how change happens very, very quickly. Not in a straight line, not necessarily slowly, but maybe slowly at first and then all at once. It happens very, very quickly because those tipping points are reached, and the market, the demand, but also the behavior change. People understand these technologies. They start to see that other people are using them. They want to use them. There's some really interesting research into solar panels, which suggests that the best indicator for whether or not a house is going to have solar panels is not their level of affluence or education. It's about whether or not the house next to them has solar panels. We really are very influenced by what is going on around us. And so this is looking at technology, but it's not just about technology. You could also look at this as a graph that tells you about behavior change and the way people live their lives. Because having, for example, a computer is not just about owning a bit of technology. That really shapes how we live, how we communicate, how we interact with other people. And these shifts are happening very, very quickly. We just have to wait for those tipping points to occur or influence those tipping points. So this is all a little bit overwhelming, and especially when you get to thinking about, well, what does it mean for the climate emergency and the whole world, the fate of the world, everything that's going on in COP at the moment. And I think what this, for me, certainly as a kind of community activist, helps me think about is we don't have to understand the whole world. We don't have to know exactly how all of those systems work, what the best thing to do is, what the solutions are. I mean, some of them might be obvious, but a lot of them aren't. But what we can do is this kind of image on the right is really boil that world down into, okay, well, what do I understand? What is in my kind of sphere of understanding and of influence? And it's probably not the whole world, but it might be a city or a town or a village or a region. And really thinking about, okay, how can I focus on that and think about that as a system? And again, not come up with a brand new solution that's going to bring in a whole new way of doing things, but think about how can I influence and create the conditions in that space, in that area, in order to create space for positive change to emerge. So as an example of that, again, talking about behavior change, I think this helps us think about, okay, what does this mean in practice? So some really interesting theories about behavior change, and one of them that I find very useful is thinking about behavior change happens in 3 ways. So in order for someone to change their behavior, they need to have the ability to do that. So again, thinking about the cycling analogy, people need to be able to use a bicycle, and they need to be able to understand how to ride a bicycle. They also need the motivation. They need to want to do it. Maybe it's about saving them money, saving them time, improving their fitness. That motivation needs to be there. And they also need the opportunity to do it. So they need the time to do it. They need to actually have a bicycle or be able to borrow a bicycle in order to do it. So we need these 3 things in order to change our behavior. And thinking about your role as a community group and all of the work that we're doing in our communities is we cannot influence all 3 of these things. Very, very rarely does that happen. And I mean, I welcome any examples of that, of all 3 of those things being able to be influenced at the same time. And so no, here, what we have to do, there's not one solution that's going to fix this, but what we can do is try and create the right conditions for those things and influence those, rather than trying to do the whole thing and then get it disillusioned or disheartened if we end up not changing any of his behavior. We put on a whole event about cycling and people come, and then it's very easy to take things personally and look at the change we want to see as being quite a linear thing. But actually, if we can step back from that and change what our outcomes are, and understand we're trying to influence that system, we can be much more specific in what outcomes are going to be. So maybe we just pick motivation, or we just pick ability, and then we kind of trust that we are influencing the system and other things will come along to have that wider influence. And maybe they won't, and maybe there won't be an uptake of cycling. But the point is, it's not all our responsibility, and we cannot control all of that. But the more we can be targeted, the more we can understand the impact we can have. We can nudge towards these tipping points. We can create the right conditions. So again, I think this is a really important thing for me, and this is an important thing that comes out of this work on tipping points. And this is not just about action at a community level, this is about action at a global level. Thinking about what came out of COP, there really weren't a lot of very new solutions. And a lot of the good stuff wasn't the things that were heralded as new solutions. For example, the kind of the deforestation work, which I think, there's a lot of problems with that, with that announcement. Some of the interesting stuff that came out was about creating conditions where we're not going to see the outcome of those conditions for quite a while, but they are there, and even just subtle changes of language that are going to influence how markets and governments change over the coming years and decades. To prove I'm not kind of making all of this stuff up, this is some work from the National Lottery. So I did some work with them a couple of months ago about their Together for Our Planet fund, which is looking to fund communities who hadn't engaged in climate action before to make a difference. And National Lottery have this booklet, Community Action for the Environment, and they talk in there about how they make a difference. So this is the National Lottery talking about how they themselves make a difference. And what we can see here is there isn't an emphasis on new solutions. There are some old existing solutions, so encouraging people to use what's already been done. So for example, reducing food, clothing, furniture waste. These are things that we know work, and it's about kind of, okay, well, can we take what others have done and keep that going? Lowering carbon emissions, saving money. Again, these are not new ideas. It's about reinforcing what we already know. But looking at 3, 4, and 5, nurturing, building, supporting, these are about creating the right conditions. This is how one of a hugely significant funder in the country, they are talking about creating the right conditions. It's not about you have to have exactly fix the problem. And I know it's not that simple, and I know the funding, it does encourage you to say be quite exaggerating about the impact you're going to have, and I'll talk a bit more about that in just a second. But I think this should be a kind of reminder that, you know, even the lottery don't really understand the impact that they're having, but there's an element of trust in creating the right conditions. If we nurture knowledge and skills, if we build belonging, community pride, if we support individual and community well-being, then these positive changes will emerge from that. This is not a new idea. This is not a radical idea. This is how things work. And kind of last thing I want to give an example of before we finish and have a Q&A is okay. So again, what does this mean? Putting this into practice, and to do that, I want to talk about one of the CAGs that I helped set up in Oxford, which is the Oxford Food Surplus Cafe. And so we set up as a project to redistribute food to create a space where there was affordable, judgment-free, healthy food in Oxford, which is obviously quite seen as a very affluent place, but there's a lot of food poverty there as well. But in doing that, what we found was happening was a lot of other benefits, co-benefits alongside that. So people were more aware of food waste. People, we ended up promoting meat-free diets, even though we didn't talk about being vegetarian or vegan, and we were predominantly vegetarian or vegan because using meat, using dairy creates a lot more hassle in terms of food standards and food safety. So it was a lot easier to be purely vegan. So we were without realizing it promoting meat-free diets. Some people were having, you know, their first ever vegan meals. And also we were training up volunteers to help in the cafe, and turned out we were then providing free cooking skills training for people who maybe weren't that confident in it. And these things had their own consequences. So we raised more awareness of food waste, and then more community projects set up as a result of that, and people kind of getting more into this idea of, okay, there is this food out there that needs to be used and can have a good impact. Some people set up a recipe book based on what we cooked in the cafe, and then sold that for a donation to support other community projects. We got a lot of feedback saying that some people have found their confidence increased in how to cook healthy meals, because again, it wasn't something that they had access to before. And these were all things that we didn't think about and wouldn't have noticed unless we got that feedback. And at the same time, we also got some potentially negative feedback in that we were told by existing support services for people who were food insecure, were at risk of being disrupted, because if we were providing free food at a certain time, an existing service was providing free food, then maybe we were at risk of disrupting their service and the kind of wider support that they offered. And so learning that, we increased our coordination with those services, changed our timings, and made sure that we weren't competing or drawing people away from those. So this kind of mapping out was really part of us understanding what our impact was and how we were part of a wider system, and that we weren't going to solve anything on our own, but actually as part of a wider system, we could have a much greater impact. And the kind of the three changes that helped us move towards was this idea of, again, certainty of we know exactly what we're going to do, to actually we don't really know what the impact of our work is going to be, but we trust that it's going to be positive, and we're going to try and collect feedback and understand what that impact has been. And secondly, thinking about initially being in this idea of control, of, okay, we can control our impact. We know exactly what we're going to do. We're going to do A, B, and C, and it's going to lead to D, E, and F. And we can control the impact we're going to have, to understanding that actually, we can try and influence it, but we can't really control it. We can't control the experience that people come to that cafe are going to have, but we can try and influence it. And again, we can try and understand that and tailor it and shape it over time. And lastly, we're very, very good at exaggeration and saying, yeah, the Food Surplus Cafe is the best project that's ever happened, and we've done, all of these a million things, and it's amazing, and everyone should give us money, and it's fantastic. To really letting go of a lot of that and focusing on, okay, we can't do everything, we're not doing everything, we're not getting 1 million people at every one of our events, but we can focus on the role that we are playing in the system, which then helps us talk about not just, well, okay, so maybe 1 million people didn't come to our events, and we had 50 people at this event, which is still really good, but also those 50 people then were influenced in these ways, and some of them went off to do this thing, and some of them went off to do that thing, and we're not claiming credit for that, but we're communicating and understanding how we are part of that system. And that was a really important turning point for us. So I'm going to finish there. When after the Q&A, we're going to talk through that example and another one, and how to go through that process yourselves. I'll just end before the Q&A by just saying a little bit more about the work that I'm doing, Green Futures Network. So again, trying to increase access for community groups, but also businesses and policymakers to resources, to research, events like these and others, and I'll share some details on how to join that network if you're interested in. And just an example, Emily touched on this as one of the resources that's available on the Devon Climate Emergency website, which is a resource that we developed at the university with the Centre for Sustainable Energy, Impact Community Carbon Calculator. So this is a free resource that many of you might have seen, which provides a carbon footprint for a parish area, which can be compared to other areas or national average. I've done it for Truro, where I live. So that's the kind of resources that we've got that sometimes we're not very good at shouting about or sharing or supporting people to use in a practical way. So those are some of the projects that I'm working on. But that's my time. I'll stop and yeah, look forward to the questions.
Fantastic. Wow. A lot of food for thought in there, Peter. Thank you so much. And also thinking, you know, in terms of some of those resources, then maybe, you know, we'd be happy to talk to you about how can we help get the word out about some of those resources and actually getting people up to speed with how to use some of those tools, which would be fantastic. And I'm sure would be, you know, that kind of support. Yeah, as Emily says, so interesting as ever, Pete. Thank. Yeah, it'd be fascinating. And I'm sure a lot of our groups would be really interested to kind of explore some of those tools further. Brilliant. So thank you both very much. We've got some questions in the chat already. And thank you everyone for prefacing them with a Q. So that's helpful. So I'm just going to pick a couple out and then we can just open it and then people can start, you know, raising their hands. I don't need to be the narrator the whole time. But if we start right at the top of the list, so this was from Lou. So to Emily, primarily, what's been the most challenging aspect of producing a Devon-wide carbon plan? Do you want to start with that?
Sure. An amazing question that no one has ever asked me on a webinar before. What is the most challenging? I think sometimes you have to manage the frustration within yourself that you know, you think it's an emergency and we need to do this as quickly as possible, but we also really need to consult people along the way and take time to speak to the partnership, including all the local authorities in the partnership, to a sufficient depth that we understand everyone's concerns and interests, and you know, go into quite a lot of detail when we're developing actions for the plan and so on. And that can feel quite slow and it's a lot of information to synthesize. I think that's one of the challenging things, the amount of information you're trying to synthesize, but actually taking a bit more time will hopefully mean that we've got a much better supported, more coherent plan.
Great. Lou, do you want to come back on that?
No, I mean, I think I can imagine that being enormously frustrating, having sat in on a few of the webinars as well. And I just, sometimes you get a lot of pushback. I imagine that's quite hard to manage when you're trying to pull together something positive. And I think that whole consultation process, I can imagine it being challenging. And I guess it's quite interesting seeing both the presentations together, that thinking, right, well, what are those conditions for change? You know, what are the right conditions that support that Devon Carbon Plan? Some of them are kind of like structure and infrastructure, but that whole community piece is huge. So I'm interested to hear what comes out from everybody. I think there was another few pertinent questions in the chat that are almost quite open-ended that I imagine everybody would have a perspective on. So no, that's interesting. Thanks.
I'd add one more thing to say that I think sometimes we can all forget that actually, yes, we need to get to the finalised plan, but actually part of getting the conditions that we need for change I think everyone involved changes a bit through the process of developing the plan. So I think we are already reorganising how people think about things through creating the plan with organisations and communities.
Great. So it does get back to Peter's slide about creating the conditions for positive change. Yeah, great, thank you. Another one for Emily, so I'm going to pick these ones off that are specifically for you first. You've probably seen this one already. And it's from Sally. So to what extent do you have influence over the county council's departments? Oh, I wish. I'm thinking specifically about transport and roads and their road building plans and expansions of cycle paths and pathways.
Well, it's a good follow on to the previous question, because you know, I think whilst you might not see immediate fruition of everything we're trying to achieve, actually there's been a lot of dialogue with pretty much all the departments within the local authorities through the climate change officers in the partnership, and that is beginning to filter through into the work of the different departments. And transport in particular, we have a lot of conversations not only with Devon County Council's transport team but also with Torbay and Plymouth, and they are they're very much taking it on board and open to it, and I think more things will start to kind of be seen on the ground, like train stations, like bus policies, like the rollout of more of these filtered traffic streets that we've seen some experiments with during lockdown. And actually we've just made a video about some of the things that the transport team are doing, so I will try and find the link to that and pop it in the chat.
Great, thank you. Sally, do you want to come back on that, or are you?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Yeah, it's just from a point of view of someone I've been involved in our neighbourhood plan, and it's the one area that we can't really access any help within that's Devon County Council's department, transport and roads and pathways and cycleways. So yeah, I was just interested to know the influence you're having and those aspects of our community.
They are very receptive to it, and I think they are going after funding at every opportunity, but funding's probably not coming through as quickly as they would like, but hopefully we can secure some more.
Thank you.
Okay, on the subject of funding, I've actually, Coroney's got a question for everybody actually, so not necessarily Peter and Emily, but is anyone else applying for the National Lottery Together for Our Planet Fund? And if so, what are your plans? Coroney, I know you've got plans.
Yes. Do you want me to say what ours are then? Sorry, yeah. I've got a silly background. I don't know how I did that. Anyway, yeah, we're hoping, well, I suppose a little bit of background. We have had an active group in the Tean Valley called Teen Climate Hub. The Facebook group has more than 300 members now, but I would say the active membership is about 1/10 of that, with a handful of people really getting on and doing stuff. And those who have got on and done things like repair cafes and so on before lockdown have worked in partnership with Christo Community Land Trust, which is a group that I chair. That's because Teen Climate Hub is not a formally constituted group, which bars it from most funding applications. It means they can't get insurance, they don't have a bank account, etc. So we work with them to enable things through the Land Trust. And we're now working on a joint application to Together for Our Planet to try to get some experts in to help us deal with exactly the things that Peter was talking about, the real complexity of creating the conditions for change, getting more of our roughly 3,000 people who live in the valley engaged and doing things differently. And there are a lot of what I would call sort of quite traditional people living here, including, you know, it's an agricultural area, people who can't perhaps see how they might change. But also, I think, recognising over the last 2 years, the journey I've come on, where there seem to be some obvious solutions, you know, let's go and plant some more trees or whatever it is, and then discovering we're in one of the most wooded areas of Devon, and the next minute, you know, you've got one of the resident ecologists saying, no, 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 we need to preserve our rough grassland, or, you know, the barn owls will disappear. So it's terribly complicated knowing what the right things are to do. So we want some expert help in getting the evidence to help us see what matters, what will make a difference, but also in getting more people involved in that. So that's what our funding bid will be for.
Thanks, Courtney.
Applying for that.
Sorry, who was that? So is anybody else putting in, getting back to the question, is anybody else putting in a bid to the Together for Our Planet pot? And if so, for what? Teresa?
So I'm part of Sustainable Tiverton, and together with some other organisations in mid-Devon, there's a bid going in to facilitate a wildlife warden scheme in all the neighbourhoods and parishes in mid-Devon as a way of getting people involved in climate action for the first time by kind of looking at climate impacts on their local wildlife and taking action to protect habitats and create new habitats and so on. So we see it very much as a way of engaging perhaps some people who haven't thought of themselves as climate activists and, you know, got involved in things before, but something that's quite appealing to all age groups and might get some more people involved. So there's a bid going in for that. There's a really great scheme already set up by ACT in Teignbridge. I'm sure there's someone here from there, where that's already happening, and we're very much kind of building on their experience to try and set something up across mid-Devon as well.
Great, thanks, Teresa. Anyone else? No, everyone.
I wasn't asking to see who the competition was. It's really to see where the potential partnerships are further down the line.
Great, thanks, Courtney.
Thank you.
Okay, what else? Bobby, let's get on to tipping points. Do you want to ask your question?
Hello. I think Peter's partly answered it, but where was my question? I have to find the wording for it again now.
What are the right conditions to create a positive tipping point for community action? How can we support every community to have a CAG group?
So, I mean, Peter answered that in quite general terms, but actually it's a question to everybody else rather than Peter. Well, maybe Peter's experience from CAG Oxfordshire, but what are those practical things that make the difference? I mean, I know we're trying with our CAG group, but it'd be nice to hear what other people think. What helps those communities take action and their, you know, start in their local communities?
I mean, I've definitely got more thoughts on it, but I welcome anyone else's comments. I mean, certainly what I used to see in Oxfordshire was I mean, before I was kind of familiar with the concept of tipping points, was exactly that in terms of exponential growth, kind of it not happening in a linear way, more and more kind of groups coming on board and seeing that it was possible, not because I don't think of any specific targeted campaign. In fact, when I was there, pretty much every new group that joined the network, we said, that's probably the last group. We don't really have the capacity to support any more groups. And then another group would come up. You know, so we weren't doing creating these new solutions to find and support new groups, but they were emerging because the groups themselves were creating those conditions by just getting on with what they were doing and talking about it and doing it in a way that was relevant to their communities. And you could really see small clusters pop up in different parts of the county where you know, groups in neighbouring villages and towns saw it happening there and then, and and kind of growing that way. But also I think another thing to remember from that is that it's a really valuable and important goal, but it's not a goal that any one organizational person can control. I've seen a lot of organizations, kind of network building, really burn themselves out by trying to do that and trying to control that outcome, when actually there's so many moving parts to that about, are people in the right place kind of emotionally, in terms of skills, instead of terms of capacity to start new groups, to do that, and that's not something that we can control. So trying to step back from that a little bit and focus more on we'll create the conditions, and if other parts of that kind of complex soup are right, then they will emerge. But if they don't, that's okay, and that's not a failing on our part that we need to kind of be exhausted by.
We have seen that, Peter, with the ripple effect of community fridges and repair cafes across Devon. We have seen that happening. It's lovely to see, and just thinking of my own experience here, we've got repair cafe in Chudley where I am, and then Bobby Tracy's been across to visit to see how we're doing, and and you can see them. That's happening all across Devon, with lots going on, which is great.
Sounds a bit like the solar panel reference that Peter made, effectively, isn't it? Yeah. But the other element that I think that stood out for me, Peter, that I think is a key condition and one that is neglected, and that is time. I put it in the chat, and that when the furlough scheme kicked in and suddenly people had tons of time on their hands and enormously motivated to want to make a difference, I think that you can move mountains. And it made me think that, like, at the moment, everybody's gone back to, like, probably even more intense than working in an office, because you have back-to-back meetings. I'm like, what happens if you were able to shift a condition within businesses to get more businesses to allocate time to their workforce for volunteering? So you'd be carving out, creating time. So say Devon-wide, you had a policy that was encouraging businesses to be able to roll that out to that workforce. I'm wondering whether that would be a positive condition that might help in local communities. Obviously, you've got the other aspects that would, you can't control what they're motivated by, but if they're also surrounded by the right types of projects, and you pull these different behaviour change elements together, and with the right conditions, that could be quite powerful. Just thinking out loud. I don't know what other people think. Deathly silence, sorry.
I thought Peter was going to come back to you.
I mean, I agree. I think you're totally right. I think there are, again, like the mutual aid support groups, there are other things other than time which means that I think, certain people in certain places were more likely to get involved and to volunteer and get involved in their community groups. And partly one of the factors is the community group existing in the first place and feeling accessible to people. But yeah, and then thinking about, well, how do you replicate that when those same conditions aren't there, can be quite overwhelming, and again, might not be possible. So again, there's the kind of the whole uncertainty of, we don't know what's going to happen next year. I mean, we talked whether it's about climate adaptation or more pandemics or other kind of infrastructural changes to our environment. It's very hard to predict, but we probably know that things are going to be more uncertain, and there are going to be more shocks to our system in the coming future. So again, how is your community group ready to respond to that? Not knowing what it might be, but knowing that the people that it serves in its wider community, their experience is probably going to be much more in flux than it has been in the decade prior to now. Whether it's about seeing flooding that is supposed to happen every 100 years now happening every year, for example, or whether it's a bit more abstract than that and it's about people having a different relationship with food because the supermarket doesn't stock the same things it used to stock and we can't get X, Y, or Z, and being ready to respond to those changes in the kind of the system around it, without trying to control it or predict it, but just be aware and kind of constantly be seeking feedback from people and constantly checking in with, can we respond to changes, or are we pretty stuck in doing things a certain way? And I think those groups, because again, thinking about during first lockdown, there are a lot of groups who were overwhelmed by people trying to volunteer with them, because sometimes it can be a problem. I don't know what to do with all of these people, and training up new volunteers is an intensive thing to do. So it's again thinking about how are we ready to respond? What are the what is our sphere of influence, and what can we do with that? And not trying to overreach, and not getting suckered into this idea of we have to be able to solve this problem and control it.
Great. Okay, there's 3 questions still in the chat that I want to pick up. So Lucy's is around mitigation and resilience, and what tips have you got, Peter and Emily, around mitigation and kind of helping our communities increase their resilience? Or if anybody else has got ideas around that as well, it's open to everybody. But Peter, have you got a starter for 10?
Yeah, Emily, were you just about to jump in there?
Oh, sorry, Emily.
No, you go first.
Right. Yeah, I think adaptation is incredibly important. Mitigation, is obviously vital, but there's a lot of attention paid to mitigation, and adaptation is less understood. And I think that partly comes back to this idea of complexity and mitigation. We can measure, we can put numbers to, okay, let's reduce the amount of carbon, and obviously there's a lot of kind of finger in the air at some of those numbers, we can't be certain, but for adaptation it's much harder. So one of the things we're trying to do at the university is support decision makers to understand how climate adaptation is thinking about risk in a very different way. It's not thinking about what's happening now, it's thinking about, well, what's likely to happen in the future, and what do we do now to reduce the impact that is going to have. And for people that deal in kind of very responsive decisions, like a local authority might, or a large business might, or the university might, which is not a criticism, it's just, large organizations often have to work in that way. It's quite a big ask to say, all of those, problems that are happening right now, put them aside for a minute and think about something that we can't definitely say is going to happen, but is very, very likely. But we know to pretty significant levels of detail what the climate is likely to be like in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years in terms of rainfall and heat, and wind speed. And while we might not know exactly, we can certainly predict trends. We're likely to see warmer, drier summers and warmer, wetter winters, and then we can start mapping out, well, what are the impacts of those things going to be on housing, on health, on tourism, on crime, on all of these other things. But it's a different way of thinking. Again, it's letting go a little bit of control, and understanding that we are part of a system that we can't control. And I think the University of Exeter is as guilty as anyone else in often talking about responses to climate change within a frame of control. This is what we're going to do to respond to this problem, and talking as though we're going to be able to control every single part of that, when we're not. Things are going to happen that we can't predict and are out of our control, and will change what is possible for us. And I think as communities, as any kind of organization, again, I think we have to, in order to be able to actually adapt and become more resilient, we have to understand that. Because I think for me, resilience is about understanding what you can control and can't. And we lose resilience when we put energy into trying to control things that we don't actually have control over. Yeah, Emily.
I would say, well, firstly, I want to plug the short talks that we had from a range of speakers at the Devon Climate Assembly. I've just put the link in the chat, on impacts of climate change in Devon. So we heard from Guy Watson from Riverford Organics about the impacts on farming. We heard about the impacts on business. There's a couple of different short talks there that you might find interesting in thinking about some of the impacts in Devon. But also, I would say that what you're doing already is really helpful for our resilience, because actually we need the human capital, we need the networks that people can redirect in different ways in times when we have to respond to those impacts, and we're more resilient the better connected we are as communities. So well done, that's brilliant, and keep doing that. And also there are sort of small things that we can all do, which I'm sure lots of you are already doing, that are both good for the environment and good for our resilience. So having water butts, for instance, so you're less exposed when we have droughts, having trees on our streets if you're in towns, so that when we have heat waves, there's more shade for our houses, and we've got some sort of nice microclimates and things like that. And also asking ourselves collectively as communities what might happen in our community. I live in a village with it's a very steep-sided valley, classic Devon landscape. There's a stream running down into an estuary. It's quite likely that we're going to flood here at some point. So I've seen the maps. There are orchards locally that have been lost over the years, but I know that some of my neighbours are really interested in restoring some of those orchards on their lands, and actually they're uphill from me, and that could help reduce the flooding in the valley. So it might seem a bit overwhelming, but actually there are kind of longer term slow burn things that we can do within our communities to think about how we can make the landscape more resilient, and also think about plans we might make. For instance, my parish council at the moment are thinking about their sort of emergency response plans, and I've just suggested to them, well, why don't you think about climate change within that as well? So we can start having practical conversations about emergency response, but also about kind of longer term resilience building. Mitigation, I didn't exactly understand what the question was in regards to mitigation, as in how can people reduce their emissions, or?
Lucy, do you want to, as it was your question, do you want to?
I think it was the other way around. I think I was aware that our projects are about mitigation, but not adaptation at the moment. But thanks, Emily, because that really actually ties in those natural solutions of tree planting and meadow creation and all the stuff that kind of everyone thinks is on the side of the main picture of climate change. Is actually really pivotal to how our landscape is going to be able to cope with all this other stuff too. So yeah, thanks.
We are sorting out the page on adaptation for our website, and we're going to try and signpost to more resources, but in the meantime maybe check out Devon Communities Together. They've got some they're sort of supporting some networking on this, and keep an eye on our website.
Great, thank you. Okay, we've got a couple more questions that are in the chat, and then I'd say if anyone wants to ask any other questions, feel free to just stick your hand up. So Neil, where are you? Do you want to ask Emily your question?
Yeah, it's about if there's any sharing nationally with the Devon Climate Emergency plans and other counties.
Emily, you're on mute at the moment.
Sorry, could you repeat that? My internet dropped out momentarily. I had a bad feeling someone was asking me a question that I didn't.
Is there any sharing of ideas between the Devon Climate Emergency plans and other counties? So can we get ideas off other counties and share our good ideas with them?
Yeah, definitely. There is an inter-authority climate change group. Peter also attends quite often, and it's very very practical, it's very pragmatic, it's very led by people saying, next meeting, can we discuss this? Because I'm working on this at the moment, and what are you doing? I need some help on that. Can we get someone in to talk to us about this? So it feels like momentum is growing and networks are growing for officers in different authorities to talk to each other and to share information. And there are some, that's quite a regional network, but there are also some more national networks that are developing. And actually, I was quite encouraged to hear, reading the government's net zero strategy, that they, it's still, I still don't understand the detail on it, but they seem to be talking about how one of the government departments for business, energy and industrial strategy could be supporting local authorities to speak to government more and to sort of network more. So that sounded very encouraging as well. So hopefully it will grow.
Brilliant, thanks.
Okay, Sally, it was a request for resources really around behaviour change techniques. So if anyone's got any, chuck them in the chat. Yeah.
I've got some, I'll dig out and share, Helen. I don't know if you're going to do a follow-up email, but I can send some stuff. Been doing quite a bit of work on that for local organisations.
Fantastic, and I'm sure Lou's got some to chuck in there as well. Yes,
I think it's such a big topic that I often think just sharing the frameworks in their own right is not overly helpful, because there are so many different theories and approaches, and actually it's almost, it needs its own session. I would just, a suggestion perhaps, if there is broader interest in thinking around behaviour change. Well, happy to pick up with you after, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, if people are interested in a session, particularly specifically around behaviour change, theory and examples, then yeah, I'm sure we could put something on. But yeah, just a show of hands, who'd be interested in something like that? And just completely, it's not committing you to it. Okay, yeah, okay. And there's lots of faces I can't see, so okay. So I'm just conscious we've got just over 15 minutes left. So we were going to go into breakout rooms. You may still have questions. I don't know whether Katie's thumb up is for the breakout room or for the behaviour change session. I'm not quite sure. But either way, I'm going to hand back to Peter to explain. I mean, we could do about 10 minutes in a breakout room with those two tools, if you think we can do it in that much time, Peter.
We certainly can, but also want to kind of check in on everyone's energy levels, where it's kind of 8:45 on a Monday evening. Yes, it's Monday.
People are smiling.
So
with their cameras on.
We definitely could go into 2 or 3 breakout rooms to discuss, or I can kind of share these. So these are 2 exercises that I've been doing with community groups to put some of the stuff that I was talking about into practice, or we could discuss them collectively. So I don't know if anyone's got a particular preference on that. Bobby, did you just unmute to share your preference?
I was just going to say discuss them collectively might work well, because we're not a huge group. It might work if energy levels are a bit low in a few places. Great.
Okay, well, I'll share the first one. Great, and currently, yes, echoed in the chat. Yes, no, I definitely, definitely empathise with that feeling, safety in numbers. So yeah, I'll kind of talk through both of these, and then we can just discuss. And if they make total sense and no one's got any questions, then we can move on to something else. But also if there's anything that kind of comes out of that that's particularly interesting, then we can go for it. So the first one, I talked through an example of this. So this is a structure that I have found really helpful since we did that project with the Food Surplus Cafe, and really transformed our understanding of what that project was and what its impact was. This is something that I've now done in every other community project I've been involved in since. And this frame is just, yeah, thinking about, so starting off just thinking about, okay, so this is our project and this is our main aim, so this is what we exist to do, but then really starting to map out what else is going on. And this, I think, is a really good example in stepping back and not thinking, because often we think about our impact usually within the frame of trying to impress someone else without wanting to put too strong a word on it, whether that's a funder or whether that's just someone else we want to join our project, for example. And that actually really restricts the way we talk about it, because again, we're trying to simplify it, summarize it, make it sound really, as impressive as we possibly can. But it often ends up with us thinking in quite linear ways, because we don't want to just say, oh, and it does this, oh, and it does this, oh, and it does that, because people will just get a little bit overwhelmed and think you're a bit strange. But actually, it's a really useful process to go through, and doing something like this internally. So thinking about how do we tell our story to ourselves about what we do, because probably everyone in our groups is going to have a slightly different perspective on what it is that we actually do. So how do we tell that story internally? I think this is a really helpful process to go through. And you don't have to use this frame at all, just something that kind of helps you think about, okay, here's where we're starting, this is what we're trying to do, but what else is going on? What is a potential co-benefit of the main aim we're trying to do that we don't control and we're not going to take credit for necessarily, but it's good to understand that that's happening. So again, if we're, if it's about cycling, if it's about food, if it's about energy, what else is going on there? So thinking about, often we talk about people saving money, for example. Okay, but what are some of the co-benefits that people might, of people saving money? And often we hear about the very negative ideas of, oh, well, somebody's saved money on their energy bills, so they're going to fly to, the Sahara or something on holiday. And yes, that probably happens, but maybe more realistically, that money can then be, kind of invested in someone's well-being and supporting a kind of a family to thrive and be emotionally ready to respond to other things that are going on, and be more kind of available for other projects. And think about what else is happening as a result of this project, and also think about what are some of the potential downsides. And again, we don't want to talk about these often outside of the group, but internally it's really useful to think about how might this project be affecting other people and other projects in a negative way? So then how can we take action to reduce that? So again, for our example, it was competing with other services that we didn't realize were going on, and then we could take action to reduce that. So I think this is a really useful thing to go through, and it's a really healthy thing to go through as well. And the other exercise, which I find really useful, is thinking about again, our kind of spheres of influence. So this first question kind of taps into that first exercise. Is think about how is climate change going to impact our community, and really going to town on that question. Whether it's going to affect kind of infrastructure, supply chains, it's going to affect who's coming to live here, who can afford to live here. Really thinking about those different ways that climate change is going to impact kind of here and now, and think about what is it that we can influence and where do those things overlap. And then the second part, which is slightly different, is thinking about, okay, who is going to be affected and how. And I welcome any particular perspectives that you've got on in your community who's going to be impacted. So it might be a particular demographic, right? For example, older people are going to be more susceptible to increased heat waves, for example, potentially, or people that live in specific types of properties, specific houses, or maybe people that live close within a flood zone are going to be affected in a certain way. And again, who can our group have an impact on? And hopefully those circles overlap a lot more, because our groups can have impact on pretty much anyone in the community in some sense, and everyone in the community is going to be affected by climate change. But really thinking about, okay, how do those things overlap? So those are just two very simple exercises to go through, but I think useful to refocus, and again think about move away from that kind of really linear, this is exactly what we're going to do and this is exactly what the impact is going to be, to letting go a little bit of that control and thinking about influence. So again, I mean, I welcome any kind of comments or questions on those, or particular perspectives. I mean, I'd love to hear any thoughts on, you know, in your community, who's going to be impacted by climate change, and how can you think about the answers to that question in different ways? Or if it's a little bit late and no one's got any comments because everyone's a bit tired, then we can also just kind of we can move on. But I'll stop talking there for a second and leave a bit of a gap.
You're on mute, Helen.
I was probably talking rubbish anyway. So I was just saying, has anyone got any reflections on either of those tools and whether you could imagine using them with your groups in your communities?
Helen, I was just going to say one quick thing, was that I think that's really interesting what Peter said about thinking about the way you sell yourselves, the story you tell yourselves. And stop trying to impress everybody and really think about it, what you're doing, because you're right, you know, certainly when you're trying to promote a local authority project internally, you're always trying to sell yourself and talk about all the best, and it's not to say the project doesn't have lots of things to sell about it, but it's just, you're right, it's sometimes blinkers you sometimes. So I think that's my takeaway, is I'm going to go away and think about all my projects when I'm not trying to impress my funders or my bosses.
That's the thing, isn't it? When often we're chasing resources, then we, you know, the temptation is to sound as bright and as shiny and as impactful as possible, to, you know, tick all the boxes and some.
Yeah, but it's very much connected to that sense of, we do something, it has an impact, and then we're on to the next thing. And that story is over when that's really not what's going on all the time. Dave, I think, is that a hand up?
Yeah.
Yeah, just to, it's good to think about it in different ways, really. We do, as an example I'll give you, we just beach cleans and regular beach cleans indoors. And what we do is we weigh what we collect. We monitor the number of people who attend, and we weigh what we collect. We just divide it into cyclable and recyclable. But what's actually happening is that really what we're doing it for is to build a community of people who are involved in the beach cleans. And actually, since COVID and things, we've asked for emails of people, contact information for people in case there's any, you know, any virus reported or anything like that. And it's actually helping us build a bit of a community for our mailing lists and things like that. And it's the soft ways in which that activity is kind of affecting people, which are really, it's more important, really, I think, in some ways.
Great, thanks, Dave. Good reflection. Lucy.
And I would reflect that as well in our Bradlinch Community Food Shed. One of our main, the main aim was to reduce food waste, so we collect the waste from supermarkets and distribute it for French and a larder. But actually, the other thing has been to get a group of 24 volunteers together who would otherwise never have worked together on anything. They're from very different parts of our community, and because it was all during lockdown, we've never actually met each other as well as a group, which has been really interesting. We've got a WhatsApp for most of them, but there's a couple who don't even have WhatsApp, so you kind of, yeah, we're kind of communicating in different ways with them as well. So that was, yeah, that's my reflection of what else is happening. And there is a potential downside, which we found actually this weekend with our food shed, is vandalism. Some local kids took some food from the food shed and threw it around the bus shelter, and there was a big Facebook storm about it. So that was, yeah, that's interesting. That's our, which I wouldn't want advertised outside of this group, but that it does happen.
Yeah, but that is an example of that that Finnish cartoon that you had about how it all goes round and round like this, and it doesn't necessarily go in a straight line, and there's learning and whatever to be had from that, although it must not feel very great at the moment. Yeah,
I think that's a good reminder that we can't control everything that happens, and we can't control how everyone's going to respond to the projects that we're doing. And it's hard, that takes a kind of an emotional toll to do that. But I think it is going back to the question about resilience. I think it is really important for that.
Yeah, great. Has anyone got any other questions, comments, reflections they want to share? We've got 6 minutes left.
I just wondered if the second tool, Peter, with the circles, have you tried that? Because I wondered like how, so I guess from the presentation on Saturday and other stuff that I'm aware of, like quite a key challenge around climate change communication is the negative aspect tends to bring on a shutdown response. And so asking that tough question of how will climate change impact our community, I would be nervous that would elicit a negative response, because other than, okay, that means we've got more sunny days, which is the only positive, I'll be worried, how do you make that a positive engagement? I guess you're talking about, well, what can we do to influence locally? So I'd be interested to know what your experience was of taking that approach and trying it. How did it pan out?
Well, I think those questions, again, they're the internal questions of telling our story to ourselves. And yes, they're not necessarily how I would recommend external engagement of telling everyone how their lives are going to be dramatically impacted. Yes, I mean, I did these tools recently with the National Lottery and people. So they're trying to reach community groups for this fund who hadn't necessarily engaged in climate action before. And so thinking about how is your community going to be impacted by climate change was a really helpful way of framing that, because people who wouldn't necessarily see what they're doing as being related to climate change could then understand the impacts. Because, well, yeah, if they think about, okay, so we're a project that supports the well-being of young people, and we don't really know anything about climate change. Well, actually, we know that climate change is going to have a huge impact in terms of eco-anxiety for young people. And there's going to be, there's already impacts, but it's going to be happening more. It's affecting, green jobs is a potentially really positive aspect to that as well, in terms of new opportunities. But there's the potential for that to be very exclusive and inaccessible to some young people. So then helping people think about, well, not about how we impacting climate change, but how are we supporting people who are impacted by climate change. And so any project that then supports the well-being of young people is in some way a climate change project, because it's taking one of those impacts we're likely to see as part of that system and building up the resilience to it. So it's about adaptation in some ways, and again, not to kind of trivialize it and say that everything is to do with climate change, although I'm sure you could kind of make that argument, but really helping people think about we don't have to know everything. I don't have to know all of the science about every single part of this, because it's incredibly complex and overwhelming. But think about, what is it that I'm good at, that I know how to do, or what is it our community group is good at, and how can we really understand the wider reach of that project. And so I think in that way, I found it to be really useful when I've used it with communities, community groups, because it can kind of help them think about a new thing that they're doing without them having to go and do a new thing. And again, it's not something that they would necessarily shout to every funder or a local councillor or anything like that. But say in this specific context, where it was a funder saying we want to fund people, and part of that is potentially groups who haven't done climate action before, they're great. There's a ready-made audience for that message of, well, we haven't done it before, but actually we think here's a way that we can have an impact. So if we can get some support and some funding, then we can increase that and be a bit more targeted. So again, it's just thinking about who's the audience and how is that part of a system. What kind of conditions are we creating that we can then we can tell that story externally. And it's not saying everything we're doing and every possible thing, but it allows us to, again, that question of focus, really focus on what's the right response in this situation.
That makes sense. Yeah, thanks. You're on mute again, Helen.
It's because I have got myself into a good discipline of putting myself on mute when I'm not talking. I just forget to take it off. So I was just going to say, anyone got any final burning questions or comments they'd like to share with everybody, or specifically to Emily or to Peter before we wrap up? Or is it that 9 o'clock time?
I'll share one comment of I went to visit a friend in London at the weekend, and they work in the Westminster and Paddington area, and she said, well, she works in very urban areas, and we're talking about, you know, what can she do with this community related to climate change. We were chatting to me a bit more, and she told me a lovely anecdote that I think it was either a food waste project or a community garden project. And one of the people who attend says, I can't wait for this to start again because I get so bored eating takeaway food every single day. And that's it, you know, talking about the alternative benefits of your project. You might think it's about food waste, you might think it's about community gardening, and for someone else it could be just a wonderful opportunity to, you know, have that fresh food in their life. So that really touched me.
Brilliant. Emily, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm sure we could all think of something similar to that within our own communities, which is fantastic. Anybody else got a final one to wrap up with? That was a lovely positive one. Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. I would like to just say a massive thank you to Emily and to Peter for your time and energy and input this evening, for tackling all those questions thrown at you. Yes, as Neil's saying, thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I love that actually, you know, for the Skillshare, the theme was creating our future story, and actually that last slide that Peter was showing, actually it kind of brought us full circle back from Saturday to, you know, telling our story and creating the story. So thank you so much to both of you for that. It's been absolutely fascinating. There are lots of, thank you also to everyone that's chucked resources and links into the chat. We will pull all of those out into some sort of follow-up email for you. The recording will be available once I've topped and tailed it. So yeah, and yes, let's explore, Emily, future ways in which CAG Devon can help get the word out about the work that you're doing, and vice versa. And also, Peter, yeah, it'd be great to explore some future conversations around behaviour change and things like that. One last thing in terms of future actions, and just really a jolly lovely morning, is that Dr. Compost, Nikki Scott, a lot of you will know him, is running a workshop with us on Saturday at Knights Hayes, all things composting, soil health, green manures, question time. There's cake, what more could you want? We know that's the successful ingredient for every community event. I've put the link in the chat. We've still got some places. So whether you're in Teambridge, Mid Devon, wherever you are, it would be lovely to see you at Knights Hayes on what will hopefully be a sunny Saturday morning. So that's an action you can do. Okay, it is past your time. It is. I'm going to let you all go. So just once again, thank you for your time on a dark Monday evening, and hopefully we'll catch up soon. Okay, take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.